Good evening, friends. Welcome to CARB's lecture series. We have Peter Graham with us today. Peter is Executive Director of Building Performance Network, an organization which works all across the globe, primarily on the building sector, trying to help implement policy, trying to devise policy in various parts of the world, and focused heavily on code compliance and code design. Peter is also associate professor at the University of Monash, which is located in Australia. He has interest in architectural science as well. Peter has worked in India in 2012. We worked together to come up with the report, which based on some work which CEPT did together. It in fact became a point for Eco-Niva Samhita, the new building code which the Bureau of Energy Efficiency has put placed in. Peter is going to talk about how building sector can help national implement contributions. I encourage all students to also visit the GBPN website, and a lot of material available to understand impact of building sector and building codes. Let me request Peter to start his presentation. And if anyone has any question, please use the chat pane or question pane to send me question at the end of the presentation. Discuss that. Over to Peter.
Thank you, Rajan. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to this forum. It's great to be able to contribute on behalf of the GBPN as well. And I wanted to just thank you, Rajan, and also CEPT for being involved in the GBPN. CEPT, for those who don't know, is an expert partner of the GBPN and has been a long-time collaborator. And Professor Rajan himself has been a major contributor to our research work on policy, particularly in India. So thank you. It's great to be able to actually contribute. I would have liked to have been there in person. We've planned this, but from time to time we've thought about it, but unfortunately conditions are as they are at the moment. And on that note, I hope that you are all well and staying motivated. This will pass, and we have a major issue that we have to face after the pandemic leaves us, and that is climate change. So I am going to talk tonight about nationally determined contributions and what they are enabling in the building sector as far as policy change and also innovation in a way. So I'm going to start with context about the NDCs, just to make sure that we all understand what they are, and then give you a run through of the status of building sector actions in nationally determined contributions. But I'm also going to talk about the building sector in national adaptation planning as well. From the point of view of building performance, it's actually quite interesting to look at adaptation issues as drivers of building energy policy and environmental policies and environmental design. And then finally, I'm going to look at some of the limitations of the current set of commitments and actions which have been proposed by countries and other entities, but also look at some of the opportunities that we've got for moving forward for both practice and research. So to begin with, what is a nationally determined contribution? Under the Paris Agreement, which was formed at COP21, all countries had to provide a commitment for reducing greenhouse gas emissions across their entire economy. And at COP21 in Paris, around about 136 countries actually provided commitments to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that included some mention of the building sector. So that's 136 countries out of around about 167 commitments which were registered at that meeting. So the building sector really did stand out as an area that many countries saw as having the potential to help drive down emissions in their economies. The next step for the NDC process was for countries to turn them from intentions into actions and update their commitments in 2020. And then there is a process of stock taking and review and updating of nationally determined contributions over time. And that's really important because, as you'll see later on, the level of ambition which is being proposed by countries is nowhere near enough to actually meet the Paris Agreement goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. A lot of the work that I'm talking about tonight was research that I conducted to develop a guide for the UN on how to incorporate building sector actions into nationally determined contributions. And you can get that, there's a link on the GBPN website and also at the UN. All right, so let's take a look now at the status of commitments and starting off at the national level. So the key point really here is that many countries have mentioned building sector actions. Very few countries have spelt out specifically what they intend to do. So while we've got quite a lot of interest in the building sector, there's still a lot that could be done to make more clear exactly what kind of actions need to be taken in different countries. But there is quite a lot going on. So when we looked at what countries were proposing for building sector contributions to achieving their climate goals, we saw that the majority of commitments were commitments to new policies or for extending the stringency of existing policies. India, for example, I'll mention this later on, uses the ECBC as an example of actions it's taking to reduce energy demand and emissions, as well as GRIHA. And countries tended to either say that they were going to adopt a new code or to increase the stringency of existing ones. The second type of commitments to technologies. So this might be a commitment to phasing out inefficient technologies, or it might be a commitment to creating a new performance standard to require better windows or better envelope technologies, different cooking equipment, or fuel switching. The next area we looked at was within the policy focus, within the policy settings, what were the focuses? And so you can see here that the majority of the commitments were to providing new codes, and many of these commitments were being made by developing countries or Annex 2 countries. You can see also some commitments to incorporating renewables, and then it tails off. When we looked at, again, within what was being proposed as a commitment, we were looking at what was the performance which countries were saying they were going to focus on in their buildings. And very much the majority of countries are focusing on improving building energy efficiency. That's normally defined as better thermal comfort and very much focused on just operating energy, cooling and heating related energy mainly. A few countries were extending beyond energy and to promoting more of a life cycle approach, green building approach. And then there were some specific mentions of different end uses which were being targeted. But interestingly, the level of commitment to net zero or climate neutral is very, very low. And finally, a lot of commitments are being made by entities other than national governments. And that's a very encouraging sign. And one of the striking features of our analysis is that cities really stand out as being a major force in promoting more sustainable buildings and certainly low carbon buildings. When we look across the different regions, we can see that there are variations, and it's interesting to look, for example, at the Latin America and Caribbean region, which commitments by countries in that region really much more focused on technologies and pretty much focusing on activities around electrification of buildings. So getting away from biomass is a big deal, and moving towards clean fuel or even full electrification. Energy efficiency comes in second, mainly to do with building envelope, and then policy reform, and finally renewables. Across the Asia Pacific, we are seeing more emphasis on financial measures. So a lot more activity in the area of climate bonds and green financing for buildings, and also some emphasis in cities as well. So you could say that across the Asia Pacific in general, cities are making commitments to reduce emissions from buildings and are looking to the finance sector for ways of being able to implement. In Africa, there are a smaller number of countries which are engaging with nationally determined contributions, engaging with the building sector in their nationally determined contributions. By and large, the emphasis on climate commitments in Africa was more around land use reform. But within the building sector, there were actually some very strong commitments with targets and timelines for implementation. So the countries that did make commitments with the building sector really were taking it seriously. And you can see here the various issues which were highlighted by those commitments, energy efficiency being the major one, mainly around thermal performance, thermal comfort, and then technologies, mainly electrification, getting away from biomass, and then finally linking climate adaptation and resilience to building performance. If we look at that, the commitments being made in Africa, again in terms of focus, much more activity on the mitigation front, more commitment to non-residential buildings and reform in that space, slightly less so in residential, slightly more on the new build, and slightly, as we go down, adaptation, renovation, and then behaviour change at the end. So what about India? India does mention the building sector in its NDC, and this is what it says. It says the commitment, the national commitment to the Paris Accord was a reduction in emissions intensity based on GDP of 33 to 35% by 2030 from 2005 levels. I'm not sure what that is in terms of total emissions saved or avoided, but what is called up in the Indian NDC is that building energy efficiency is one of the key strategies which they have highlighted to enable that goal to be reached. The Indian government also included a description of building sector activities already taking place as an example of India's existing commitment to climate action, and Grihar and the ECBC were noted there. So I'm sorry, I've lost the graph here for some reason. It might be my monitor, but what this is supposed to show you is that, I'll see if I can load it again. No. So in terms of commitments in India, of the total commitments to building sector actions, 83 are with companies. And so the private sector is really taking the lead in building sector actions. And cities are the next highest, and then the investment sector is after that. Sorry for the graphic. Within the private sector, there's a whole range of commitments being made, and many of the commitments which are being made that are what's called collective actions, which are more kind of global framework actions, are very ambitious. They're far more ambitious than the national commitments are. So a number of businesses have signed up to commitments to, achieve get onto a 1.5 degree trajectory and head towards net zero. Some companies that I've shown here are making more specific individual commitments to achieve change, and quite a number of the building sector commitments, the companies in the building sector who are making commitments are using carbon pricing, and many are looking at reducing emissions from their own operations. And you can see just a couple of examples here. This was, Mahindra was interesting in that it was one of the few companies which was making emissions intensity reductions sort of per unit area of their main operations. And so it's quite a specific measurable commitment. Most commitments, it's fair to say, avoid being measurable. So it's good to see commitments being made with targets. So an example from cities, Coimbatore is in part of the Buildings Efficiency Accelerator program of Sustainable Energy for All, and that program supports cities to double the rate of their energy efficiency improvement in the building stock. So this is basically encouraging renovation of existing buildings. And on the finance sector, for example, State Bank of India is looking to reduce CO2 emissions from its own operations by 100% by 2030, so to be carbon neutral by 2030. So that's an example of the organisational commitment, but of course there are commitments being made to issuing climate bonds and green bonds and other things like that. Okay, so that's a quick run through the mitigation side of commitments. Countries are also encouraged to make commitments on climate change adaptation as well. Some countries included adaptation measures in their nationally determined contributions, and others have established their own separate national climate change adaptation plans. And this, from my point of view, is actually where most of the motivation is for working on building performance, because we're not looking at the building performance from the point of view of just energy and climate mitigation. We're looking at buildings performing as shelter and as protection from the elements and as places to remain healthy and so on, and really refuges from the most extreme impacts of climate change. So there's some impacts on here. The slide isn't working, and I apologize for that. But basically this is pointing out that there are really significant impacts being felt by because of climate change now. And as we project those sorts of impacts out into the future, we can see that there's a significant number of people who are going to be influenced by the impacts of climate change that we're already starting to see occur. And that kind of impact is really disproportionately felt by the urban poor. And so where there are cities with large informal settlements, there is major risks to health and to life and economic development opportunities for those people. So countries are starting to take it seriously. This is a map showing countries which have included building sector actions in their national adaptation plans. Not all countries have developed their adaptation plans yet, so that's a little bit of the reason why there are some gaps in the map. But the blue represents countries that have included building and construction actions in their adaptation plans. Green is where adaptation actions for buildings and construction have been included in their nationally determined contribution, NDC. And the yellow is where countries have made building sector actions in both adaptation and the mitigation, NDC. So it shows you that you know, for those countries that are actually putting together their adaptation plans, the building sector is considered to be a key sector for helping to provide resilience and adaptation. So what are the issues of concern? So these issues come from, we did quite a lot of content analysis of the adaptation plans, and what we're seeing here is that in terms of what countries are worried about and what they're planning to address with buildings, issues like flooding are really predominant. And so one of the ways of addressing the flooding issue is looking at where vulnerable communities are living in flood-prone areas and trying to look at you know, relocation or fortification of communities to mitigate the risk of loss of life and so forth. Extreme weather, extreme heat, extreme storms are particularly worrisome for countries, and they're looking at buildings as both shelters from extreme weather, and they're worried about whether the construction quality is appropriate and whether or not the building codes are stringent enough from the point of view of structure and thermal comfort and performance, fireproofing. Yeah, and it goes on. So heat waves is another really important one. Countries are beginning to get very worried about heat stress in buildings. So that's the overview. And then when we look more closely at what countries are incorporating as issues in their adaptation plans specific to buildings, here are some of them. So part of it is that urbanization is increasing the level of informal settlements in many countries, and so there's an increasing vulnerability of urban populations. Countries are worried about buildings not being designed for future climates, and so there is quite some work looking at, you know, we're doing it in Australia at the moment, where we're looking at how our heat wave conditions are getting worse and worse, and we're experiencing more days above 35 degrees Celsius than we ever have, and our houses are really not designed for that heat, and so it causes issues with people needing to adapt with, you know, split system air conditioning and so forth, or perhaps not being able to afford to deal with the heat stress that they're experiencing. So how do bioclimatic design principles need to change? How do performance measures in building codes need to change in order to be fit for a future of extremes? Exterior environments, urban planning and urban design are really starting to take urban heat islands seriously. And so that also influences building design, of course, looking at addressing street shading, the level of ability to absorb heat or re-radiate heat on building surfaces, whether or not we're talking about vertical gardens or increasing tree canopy or green roofs or white roofs. All these things are being considered within building sector actions in the adaptation plans. Real estate assets are a big issue. In this was particularly an issue that was brought up in the Australian Adaptation Plan, noting that most of our expensive real estate is on the coast and very vulnerable to sea level rise and extreme storm conditions. So there's a major issue there. And the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors from the UK has done a review of insurance risk and come up with a report looking at climate-based obsolescence of building assets. So if you're managing a portfolio of buildings and you've got a large number of B-grade office buildings in already warm climates, the report from RICS says that you may well need to divest because those buildings will become uninhabitable within the next 20 years. And then we've got construction markets. So there's a big push on to provide incentives for retrofitting. From an adaptation point of view, the retrofitting activities are being called on for improving the structural integrity of buildings, improving the thermal comfort of buildings, and the energy efficiency so that we can more cost effectively incorporate renewable energy and distributed supply, which improves resilience as well. But there needs to be market transformation in order to really get those sorts of programs working without government subsidies. And also related to that kind of activity is how we can stimulate jobs and economic opportunity by making these sorts of actions. So money is required in order to take all of these actions, and there is a major gap in the level of funding available by the international community. You can see current total funding is around about 9.5 billion a year, and it needs to be in the order of 55 billion a year by 2030 in order to address the projected impacts of climate change on the built environment. Priority outcomes that countries are looking at the building sector to help achieve. So all of these keywords down here are words which are far more frequent in the adaptation planning and the rationale given for better building design than climate change itself or energy efficiency. So innovation, equity, affordability, health, flooding, thermal comfort, resilience. It's all about the quality of building. It's not about the sort of the energy related impact of building. So in terms of thinking about how we make inroads to policy reform, we are obviously faced with a situation where there are greater priorities in the minds of public policymakers around building performance than greenhouse gas emissions associated with energy use. Not to say that that is not important, because indeed addressing some of these priorities requires a huge level of energy efficiency improvement. So the largest goal for countries related to buildings was really integrated planning. So looking at integrated land use planning and urban land use planning, urban design, and relating building design, urban design, transport planning and other things together. So there's certainly an appetite for integrated solutions. Focusing specifically on the building industry in many countries, the focus is mainly on upgrading regulations and standards to improve the structural integrity and thermal performance of buildings, anticipating much more extreme environments in the future. And then capacity building for government agencies in implementing regulations and standards, and also capacity building for trades and professionals in being able to actually design and construct higher performance buildings. And quite interestingly, in contrast to the mitigation aspects that are called up in the nationally determined contributions, the adaptation strategies are far more holistic and call up more green building measures, looking at water, materials, waste, indoor environment quality, as well as energy performance. So there are a few other specific actions that are called up as well, but those are the main ones that are specific to building sector reform. All right, so just to finish off, where are we in terms of the 2-degree target, or the below 2-degree target? At the moment, the level of commitments isn't sufficient to meet the Paris goals, so there needs to be an increase in the scope of commitments. So more building types need to be included, and there needs to be an increase in performance. So not just incremental changes in performance, but getting to zero emissions is very important. And setting targets that are measurable in that direction are also really important. And finally, actually integrating mitigation and adaptation strategies. And that goes not just from a policy point of view, but also from a building design point of view, can really help to bridge that gap that we've got at the moment between the level of ambition currently committed to and what we need to actually achieve the Paris goals. This map shows you the level of coverage in terms of emissions from different countries that under their commitments. So 75% coverage is rare. Canada and a couple of other countries have it. Many countries are at a sort of 25 to 50% coverage. Some countries haven't mentioned how much of any specific targets that you could measure the emissions impact of their commitments on the building sector, and some haven't got anything at all. This is an easier way of looking at the scope of NDC commitments, and this is in terms of building performance. And you can see that the blue is existing policy and the grey is the NDC coverage. So lighting is moving towards a kind of a commitment to coverage of emissions from that entire end use. Water heating is still lagging. Space cooling is moving up. There's quite a lot of commitments to address cooling demand. Heating, on the other hand, is very much behind. And then when we talk about building envelope, thermal performance of envelopes, we can see that there's about government policies are covering about 50% of the emissions potential at the moment. NDCs extend that to 70%, but there's still quite a way of going before we can see policies that are delivering building envelopes that cover most of the emissions associated with their performance. So that's something to focus on. From other research that we're doing, I finished a report for the UN, which was released about 2 months ago now, a major rapid systematic review of building performance policies and what their impacts were. And so what's coming out of that research is that policy packages, as we have thought, are really the best way of driving down emissions quickly and cost effectively. So part of what we're looking for in the next revisions of NDCs are for countries to commit to policy packages that include more ambitious codes, but also rating and disclosure policies for existing buildings and appliance standards and energy efficiency obligations. They're all policy measures which have got positive cost benefits. We're also doing some more research now, looking at how countries are designing the implementation strategies for their building sector actions. And we've, again, using kind of content analysis approach, developed a kind of best practice framework for how you should design your implementation strategies. So that report should be published in the next couple of months. Said that there are lots of commitments being made by entities other than countries, and so this is just a graph showing a collection of national, subnational, and industry commitments being made. I don't expect you to read the quantities off this graph, but it's just to show that there is an ecosystem of commitments out there now, which provides us with an opportunity to direct action towards achieving the Paris Agreement. So the real work that we're doing now is to look at how we can offer what's called vertical, horizontal, and diagonal integration. So I suppose the easiest way of thinking about this is that a country could look right across its entire building sector and find the most ambitious commitments being made, and then link those ambitious commitments up to the national commitments, so that we can see, so at least it's giving governments confidence that committing to zero emissions by 2030 is something that already companies or cities within their supply chain, within the value chain, are already comfortable with. Okay, so a few final thoughts. So, cut a long story short, the ambition level in existing commitments to achieve the Paris goals is insufficient, but looking for synergies between high impact mitigation and adaptation actions can really help. The first thing to really note is that it's non-climate drivers which are forcing the issue in terms of policy reform and also design innovation in this space. And if we look at some of the things which are being worked upon, you can see that there's a real appetite for integrated approaches. So integrating building and precinct information modeling, for example, to get to integrated urban policy, looking more at prefabrication, looking at more climate adaptive building envelopes, looking at more integrated building management systems, coming back to some of the tried and tested principles of long life, loose fit, low energy design and construction, looking at integration of renewables and smart technologies, improving data and network security, and designing with storage and things like increased space for local food production, on-site energy production, and this whole dialogue about positive design, positive energy, positive water, etc., and addressing urban heat island with building design and integration of landscape. So they're really the main moves. That then drives us towards policy reforms which can support that kind of more integrated approach. And many of these ideas are ancient. They're not new ideas. Bioclimatic design, adaptive comfort standards, and so on are really things which are well known. But I think we now have an opportunity, given we are in a time of crisis, to really be able to push the envelope and see some of these ideas which have existed outside the mainstream of the industry for many years start to make a real difference, because there's no other choice really when you have a look at the projected impacts of climate change coming forward. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your patience with the slides. It's got me again on the last slide, but that should say thank you. And for more information, you can see the GBPN website. And there's also quite some resources about NDCs on the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction website too. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Rajan, and see if there are any questions or comments.
Thanks, Peter. I have one question from Billy Jain. I also want to ask, want to request quite a comment, but let me read out what Billy Jain wants to ask. Asking that, could you share some case examples of adaptation financing? Some example where business case for adaptation worked. That's what the question is.
Okay. So if I just repeat the question, so it's about an example of where, did you say the business case for adaptation is worked?
That's true.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good question. Business case for adaptation. So when we look at the costs and benefits of adaptation, you have to look at them. You have to look at who's at most risk, who's going to bear the most costs, and what's the return on investment. Where should the investment come from. If you're talking about individual builders, and you're talking about, if your question is implying that there is a likely cost impact on of like an upfront cost impact of construction because of having to address adaptation and mitigation of of emissions and deal with the climate impact, it's possible to say that there could be an increased cost. Now that doesn't mean that there isn't a business case for it though, because if you think about the report that I mentioned from the Institute of Chartered Surveyors, they are demonstrating that building poor quality buildings or building buildings which aren't fit for future extreme climates is a bad business decision, because you're basically building an asset which will become stranded. You won't be able to rent it. You won't be able to afford to maintain it. It will become a stranded asset, a lost. It'll become a loss over time. So I think from that point of view, there's a business case. When it comes down to the level of the individual builder, though, it is true that with any regulatory change, there is an increased cost for a period of time. But the research, the global experience as published in the research on policy impacts shows that on average, it takes 5 years or less for the construction costs associated, the increased construction cost associated with a change in regulation to be normalized to within what would be a normal price fluctuation in a market. And there's a learning effect which occurs when new regulations are put in place as well. So I think my argument would be that there is a business case for adaptation, even if there is an increased upfront cost in the short term, because on the one hand, just from a pure investment point of view, it isn't good business to invest in buildings that are going to become quickly obsolete. And then, of course, from a societal point of view, if I'm thinking about public investment and the social cost benefit, there's really no question that it costs far more to not take action than to take action. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think I wanted to unmute, but she's not getting it. Anyways, we have another question from Amanda and Tiago. The question is, given our COVID-19 situation, are we falling back on achieving our targets towards Paris Agreement?
I think in the short term, this is obviously reducing short-term emissions, because there's a lot less consumption of fossil fuels right now, particularly in the transport sector. The major risk is that in an effort to quickly stimulate economies and address the economic impact of COVID, governments will simply put money into maintaining the status quo, or reducing some of the environmental protections that we've managed to incorporate into building design and building policies, because they're afraid that will slow down the pace of an economic recovery. So I think there's a risk, definitely, that in trying to quickly stimulate an economy, governments miss the opportunity to actually reform markets, so that what they're building their economy up with is a more environmentally friendly building stock. On the other hand, there is a lot of evidence to show that one of the best ways that you can create jobs and stimulate economic development is by investing in more stringent building performance measures, and particularly in supporting the renovation of existing buildings. It's quite a strong evidence base to show that investment in renovation programs, energy efficiency renovation programs, creates a lot of decent jobs and a lot of jobs in local markets, and it also stimulates a supply chain. So, yeah, short answer to your question is yes, there's definitely a risk at the moment that the race to stimulate economies will lock in poorer performing buildings for longer than we would have hoped. But on the other hand, there is an opportunity to be able to actually intervene in some of that decision making to ensure that government stimulus money is going towards stimulating markets for more sustainable buildings.
Thanks. There are two more questions, one from Priyanka and one from Raghav. Let me read out what Priyanka Kocher from GBPN wants. From the India slide, it seems that the private sector is moving more aggressively as compared to policy initiatives, essentially through ECPT in Bihar, in mitigating the impact of climate change through the action in built environment. Could you please speak more about how information on private sector initiative has been collated?
Yeah, sure. The data that we're using for the private sector commitments is coming from the UNFCCC NASCA database. So this is the climate action database. So all of the information, the information that we're deriving is from publicly made commitments. So if it's not registered publicly, we don't know about it. There's a couple of things to say about the way you read the proportion of commitments, because it is not right to simply compare the number of commitments being made and infer that there's more emissions being covered by one sector over another. So if you look at this slide that I've got on the screen now, which is the one for India, there's one nationally determined contribution, right? So there's one national commitment, but that national commitment covers a vast range of emitting sectors of the economy. And in the private sector, there are 83 commitments which are focused or influence buildings, but they're not all zero emissions commitments. Some of them are, quite conservative incremental commitments to improving energy efficiency of offices or operations. And so it is true that the private sector is, what I want to point out here is that the private sector is certainly looking at the building sector, looking at their own buildings, looking at the buildings they're renting, and looking at their operations and environmental management strategies. And this is a really good opportunity for governments to align and to incorporate the commitments being made by the private sector into their implementation strategy, because there's a sort of there's a strong bottom-up push, if you like, for achieving mitigation. So I hope that, Priyanka, I hope that answers your question. But again, very important to point out that even within countries, commitments some are very strong, some are very weak. The main point here is that we have got commitments across the private sector, at the subnational level and at the national level, and we've got commitments to action in the building sector which are coming from, you know, enabling industries like finance and other things. And so the opportunity is a combined strategy.
Okay, thanks, Peter. And the last question is from Raghav. He wants to understand, how do we really communicate about global warming and NDC to a layman?
Good question. I think the best way of talking about it to lay people is maybe the commitment itself is really important. I mean, so the first thing to communicate is that you know, climate change is happening. There's a need to take action. That there are commitments in place which show, you know, who's taking it seriously, and that because of that, there's a system of support which is accessible to help change practices. So that's one way of looking at it. I think if you're talking about lay people in the building sector, you know, I think everywhere in the world the building sector is very constrained and very conservative when it's thinking about change, because most of the construction activity in the world is being conducted by very small operations. And so talking about commitments to climate action as if they are a requirement for further regulation and further sort of need for change, which a small business finds difficult to afford, it may well be the wrong way around. But if you look at it, if you were going to be an advocate in this space and talk to tradespeople and talk to builders, I draw on the experience of the French government when they were negotiating the renovation targets that were required by the European Commission. And of course, the building sector were pushing back, saying, no, this is a regulation and it's going to cost us money and we don't have time to learn new things and it's all going to be too hard. And then the French government provided some modelling to show what the increased market for building activity was going to be when these new regulations passed, particularly the renovation requirement. And the French Federation of Builders came on side to talk to their practitioners and explain that if they supported the change in regulation, it would create a new market for small construction projects, and that market was going to be larger than the renovation market that occurred during the rebuilding after the Second World War. So with that view of the opportunity for new work and for growing businesses, I think that's another way of making a case to people who may not care that much about the international framework conventions and national commitments.
Thanks, Peter. I think with that, we sort of close this session. I wish to Peter, it's pretty late right now in Australia, and thanks for spending time with us talking about the topic. And hope to see you on CEPT campus very soon, probably 2021.
Yes.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rajan, for the opportunity, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.